From time to time, people come to me with criticisms of Panama, and they're of a particular nature. You know, I don't mind people criticizing Panama. I criticize countries too and so forth in a constructive way, I hope. But these particular criticisms are focused on one particular type of problem, and that is, simply put, we have something in my country that is really great, that's really super, and Panama doesn't have that, and why doesn't Panama have that? And it really irritates me that Panamanians don't seem to be concerned about this, and so on and so on. And it can be quite negative, and sometimes it's justifiable. In my mind, if you don't like something or you don't find something you have to have, then that's a good reason to look at another location. It's not a problem. I don't care whether you end up in Panama or not. You need to be where you need to be. And if it's Panama, that's great. And if it isn't Panama, that's okay too. But sometimes I think there's a loss of perspective on some of the issues that are raised. And that's what I want to talk about today. The business of not having something that seems to people from another nation to just be a necessity in life. I will frequently use the pronouns we, our, and so forth. And once in a while I like to remind people that I am a citizen of the United States and I have no intention of giving that citizenship up, but I'm a permanent resident here in Panama. This is my home, and it is my center of activity. My friends, my associates, my business, everything that I'm trying to do is centered right here in Panama. And I have a responsibility, I believe, as a permanent resident, as someone who's given a great deal of freedom to work and live here in Panama, to do my best to help Panama and to build with the citizens. Panamanians run this country, and there's no question about that. But we who are permanent residents, we're part of that community, and we need to be supportive of it. So I think in those terms, and I'm not the least bit uncomfortable with it. Now, when I look at some of the issues that people raise, I recognize that they're related to money. It's as simple as that. There are two things that should be kept in mind when you're dealing with things that are missing here in Panama. One is the subject of debt and deficit. Now, one of the more interesting facts about Panama, and many other smaller countries as it turns out, is that the debt burden here is very, very, very low in comparison to most of the nations from which you come, the overwhelming majority of them. Here, we often measure it in what is the debt burden as a percentage of GDP. What that means is that if the country took all the money that it made in a year, could it pay off all the debt that it owes? And of course, you don't do that, but it does allow you to make a comparison between countries. And in Panama, it would take about 5 months, a little less than 5 months, to pay off the entire national debt. But in the countries you're coming from, that turns into 6, 7, 8 months, a year and a half, 2 years, 2.5. There's a huge gap. Panama's debt burden is much lower than it is in 98% of the nations that retirement wave members and other people come from. And they are very touchy on this topic. Right now it's running about 40% of GDP. People think that's a little high. They want it to go below that. We've been pushing it down year after year, and whenever it stops or it starts to rise again, it's a front page article in the newspapers. And people are saying, what's going on here? Why is the debt rising? And that's a debt to compare to, say, 90, 100, 110% in a place like the United States, as high as 250% in a country like Japan. So what we see is very high debt burden here is exceptionally low in comparison to most of the nations that you come from. Likewise with the deficit, the National Assembly here has by legislation set certain levels that they allow the deficit to reach, and they lower it every year by a certain amount. Now, there are exceptional circumstances when they can go beyond that and so forth, and those have occurred, but they're always a matter of controversy when they do occur. Right now, this year, we're aiming at 1% of the GDP as the deficit, the budget. I stop and think about that, and I think that sounds pretty good when you consider that, for instance, in the European Union, European nations are expected to keep their deficits below 3% of GDP. And many nations have had a lot of trouble doing that. Even France and Germany have had difficulty in meeting those targets, and they're 3 times higher than the target here. Now, some people will argue that maybe we are keeping it a little bit too low, that we may strangle ourselves, so to speak, and not grow as quickly as we need to. But really, it is, again, a major issue in the country whenever that percentage starts to grow, and people get upset about it. So people are highly sensitive on it. In addition to that, keep in mind that this is a very rapidly growing country, and it has a lot of needs. So when it does borrow, it borrows substantial sums, like for the expansion of the Panama Canal is just one example. The importance of that kind of debt, though, is that you could say it's a good debt in comparison to bad debt. Bad debt occurs when nations buy things that make them feel good, that don't really produce anything, but seem to make life a little bit easier or so forth. Good debt is the debt that you go into in order to be able to do things that in the future are going to produce income. The purpose being that the revenue that you receive from whatever it is you're building or you're creating is going to far exceed the debt and make it very easy to pay that debt off and lead to future profit for the country. As opposed to debts that, it's like in your own life, just going into debt to take a vacation. It's nice, but it doesn't really produce anything. That kind of debt is not particularly appreciated, but we find it in a number of nations in the world. You can decide for yourself whether that occurs in your own country. But the simple fact of the matter is that this country follows a policy on debt and deficit that is far more conservative, far stricter, far more responsible fiscally than is true of the bulk of the countries that send people here. And in other nations, justifiably, the concern is we're borrowing money that is going to have to be paid off by our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren and our great-great-grandchildren because we have so much debt. In fact, one of the signatures of a so-called advanced nation is a very heavy debt burden. That, to me, doesn't make a lot of sense. What Panama does may be a little too conservative sometimes, and that's a debate here, but it is, to my way of thinking, far more responsible than is true in other nations that are sending people to us. So if we don't have it, it may simply be because we're not willing to go into debt to create it. Not yet. In time, when the money is available, when the debt makes sense, then we can do that. And if you've been here 20 years ago or 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, and then came back just recently, you will see that we made huge progress and so much has been accomplished in the country following this particular pattern. So it's not as if we have prevented the country from growing, but it has grown in many respects, financially particularly, far more responsibly than is true in many other nations. And that may be one reason why we don't have something that you expect to find. In addition to the attitude toward debt and deficit, there's another item here that is associated with that, but should be dealt with separately, and that's the use of the US dollar as the currency here in Panama. Now, you'll notice if you're new that there's this thing called the Balboa. Balboa coins are frequently found here. There's a 1 Balboa coin, which is exactly the same value as $1, but the dollar is the currency. The Constitution of the Republic of Panama does not allow the government to create paper currency. It can create its own coins, but not paper currency. It doesn't have to use the US dollar, that's not mentioned. It could use any of the major currencies that it chose to, and it can change at any time it sees fit to do so. But it doesn't allow them to print their own. And 99% of the money that's out there in terms of total value is in paper. And that's a critical thing. Other countries, some of them have, as Costa Rica, for example, has its own currency plus the dollar. Well, we just don't have our own paper currency here. As a result, among other things, we don't have a central bank because we don't need one. We don't set the interest rates that way. They're done in the market. But more importantly, and I try to stress this with people, is that Panama, every single dollar in this country, every single dollar has to be earned. It cannot be printed. And that's incredibly important, because I've worked in a number of countries in Latin America and Asia and Africa where they printed their own currency, and they needed more money, they just turned on the printing presses, and it led to an economic disaster. Here, they can't do that. Even if they borrow money, as they did for the canal expansion, for example, that's in dollars, it has to be paid back in dollars, and the interest has to be paid in dollars. Every dollar in the economy has to be earned. You might say that Panama does business the old-fashioned way. It earns its money. It's a very good idea. It has led to a kind of self-discipline in the country that's exemplary. I just don't see it in most countries similar to Panama at various stages of their own development. As long as they print their own money, people feel they can just print more and have more. It doesn't work that way. Unfortunately, that just is not a good way to run an economy. But when you have to earn it, then you take a very different attitude toward things like debt and deficit and expenditures for the coming year and so forth and what have you. It's maybe that what you're looking for, again, is something that's going to cost a lot of dollars. We're going to have to be sure we can earn those dollars in order to pay them back. Panama's bonds that he uses to raise the money are given investment grade status. And as a result, the country pays a much lower interest rate than it would if they did not. For instance, our neighbors in Costa Rica pay substantially more for their interest rates for their borrowings than we do. And this has been very critical also to reducing the burden of interest payments on the budget. So we're looking at debt and deficit. We're looking at the use of a currency that we cannot print, that we must earn. We see the results that have come to us in terms of being respected by other societies, by people who judge these things, that we're investment grade, we're not speculative, as so many other nations in South America and Central America are listed. It makes a great deal of difference. All these issues seem to slow down the economy, when in fact, it's been the exact opposite. The economy is growing very successfully. We've added a lot more. We've grown so much more quickly than any of our neighbors that there's no connection. There's really no comparison between us and them in that regard, despite the fact that we have this stringent control of debt, deficit, and the use of the dollar. So again, when you're thinking about what's missing in Panama, that requires large sums of money particularly, keep in mind, the Panamanian people set their priorities and they decide what it is they want now, what they need. They've done, I think, a pretty exceptionally good job of it over the last decade, and you can see it all around you. So I'm not concerned too much about that. I know that frequently people come and mention something as they have in past years, and 2-3 years later we have it. But it comes when it's time to come. Now, Panama is not perfect. There are errors and mistakes and so on. But it certainly seems to me that it has done a far better job of handling money than is true of most of the nations in which I have worked, and those are 40, 45 of them. And those include, well, beyond those, nations that are considered to be advanced economies. I think it's something to be kept in mind, and it provides perspective. Now, if you don't find what you need, you don't stay here, you don't come. That's perfectly understandable. But sometimes, with some items, you might stop and think to yourself, okay, I can understand why that's not here yet. And maybe it will come in a little while. But I think there's a lot of value to be living in a country that has that sort of control over itself, self-discipline to maintain this system for over a century successfully. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. I hope it answers, if not your questions, that gives you at least that different perspective on what's happening in Panama and why some things aren't quite ready yet. Thank you.